intimacy. This isn't just about sex. I've heard women say, we used to kiss and hold hands, or I used to tap his bum in the kitchen, but I don't do that anymore. So what ends up happening is we stop flirting with each other, talk about what our needs are.
Does it have to be an end goal?
So where you put your hand over your partner's hand and you guide their hand over your body. Then you show your partner where you like to be touched, how you like to be touched in that area, what amount of pressure do you like in that area. I think it is important to broaden our idea of sex and also takes pressure off, especially if you're having pain or maybe for men whose erections aren't as reliable.
And opens the door to other experiences. So how does one expand that menu? TTOMers, we're back. Remember, that little subscription button really helps us, so don't forget to click it, like, and share. I thought it was really important to bring back Monique Voorn for a second discussion around communication and relationships as it pertains to sexual wellness through midlife. Monique, welcome back.
Thank you so much.
So when we talked with you the last time, we really focused on symptoms and solutions. You touched upon how we communicate that. It's really tough because if you're not feeling well, it's going to impact your relationship. And when I talk about relationships, I really want to give a shout out to everyone who, not everyone's in a long-term relationship. There's divorce that happens in midlife and dating and all kinds of situations. But nonetheless, your sexual health is impacted. So how do we communicate through that?
I think it's making sure, I mean, this isn't a Monique or Beatrice issue. It's a couples issue if you have a partner. And so I think it's really important to include your partner. It's often very helpful to have these conversations outside the bedroom, you know, not in the midst and things aren't going well, or it's really great to kind of find a time when you're both, you know, there aren't other distractions and you're both pretty relaxed to have. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that if you have a partner, this is a couples issue. So if your partner was a man, for example, and developed erectile dysfunction, which a lot of men do as they age, you wouldn't say, you need to go handle that and deal with that and then come back when you're ready, right? So similarly, I think it's really important to include our partners because it's the changes are happening for them as well. And so the other important thing I think is to try and have these conversations outside the bedroom at a time when you know, you're more relaxed, there aren't distractions, but where you're really in a good place and the whole goal is really just to try and understand each other. So just coming together with, you know, an approach of curiosity and trying to understand one another.
That's a really good communication tool, curiosity.
Yeah, I think we're really good at making assumptions. We make assumptions about what our partners think or want or don't like, and I think we have to be really careful about that. And I think it's really important to check those out with each other.
Yeah, because I mean, there can be this weird thing that happens if you are experiencing pain during sex and you're avoiding it. You mentioned the retreat. So now we're both retreating.
Exactly, and you start to have this disconnect because your partner is sort of wanting to respect the fact that you don't seem interested and you're not interested. So even if you used to initiate, you're not initiating as much. And there's a real disconnect that can happen. And I think having some discussion around, you know, intimacy. So this isn't just about sex and the mechanics of sex. It's about intimacy. And often what happens is, you know, I've heard women say, oh yeah, well, we used to kiss and hold hands, or I used to, you know, tap his bum in the kitchen or whatever, but I don't do that anymore because I don't want him to think I'm interested. And so what ends up happening is that we stop touching each other. We stop flirting with each other. We become almost like ships passing in the night. And so I think that just speaks to how important it is to communicate around this. And we're not very good at communication. And then communicating about sex, I think, is even more challenging, right? We, you know, for most of us, if we've been in a longer term relationship, you know, we develop like scripts almost, a way of being sexual with our partner that just flows. But then when things start to change, things hurt, there's dryness, we need to grab for lubes, who's going to do that? I think it can really change things and make things feel a little bit awkward initially. So even having conversations about, you know, I'm having a lot of dryness. So I thought we could go and maybe look at what different lubricants they have and incorporating that. And like, how do you
engage together in that?
Exactly. Go to the store together. Again, because it's a couples issue in that sense, right? Talking about like, so who's going to get it from the drawer, or, you know, who's going to apply it. And the reality is bringing aids like this in can feel very clumsy initially. So, you know, the more you can eroticize it, and the more, you know, so applying lube in a really sensual way, for example, makes it feel less clinical or like we're less broken.
Yeah.
Instead, it sort of enhances the experience.
That's really insightful. I want to go back when you mentioned, you know, I don't flirt as much anymore. I don't want to, you know, because I'm afraid of what comes next. So let's talk about, well, does the next always have to come? No pun intended.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, let's
Touche.
Let's talk about what that can look like. You know, does it have to be an end goal?
And I think we talked a little bit about this in our first conversation together about how we're pretty like narrow-minded in regards to sex. We tend to be very goal-oriented. You know, we do a little kissing, touching, but we're ultimately moving toward penetration and orgasms. And, you know, one of the things that can be really helpful is to explore, you know, especially if you're having pain or discomfort with penetration, is to explore other ways of being sexual. So Venus, for example, spelled VENIS. If your viewers are curious and look that up, it stands for very erotic non-insertive sex. So, you know, there are all kinds of people who don't have penetrative sex for various reasons. And it's just, you know, it sort of exposes you to different ideas and different ways of having, you know, very pleasurable sex, but that doesn't necessarily have to be painful. But yeah, I think it is important to broaden our idea of sex. Like we think of, you know, penetration, that's the real sex.
Yeah.
And everything else is foreplay. And I really ask the couples that I work with to kind of step back and broaden their idea of that. And to see sex instead of as almost like when you go to a restaurant and there's a menu that's full of many different options. And tonight you might choose, you know, this option, but there are many other options that are an end in themselves, that just that alone can be incredibly pleasurable and also takes pressure off, especially if you're having pain, or maybe for men whose erections aren't as reliable, you know, worrying about, is an erection going to show up? When you're doing things that aren't penetration focused, then it takes the pressure off
and opens the door to other experiences.
Exactly.
So how does one expand that menu? You mentioned Venus as a resource. What are other resources to help us expand the menu?
I love the sensate focus exercise.
What is
So
that?
this is something that was developed by Masters and Johnson
Okay.
years ago. But we recommend it and talk to couples about it often. It's a beautiful way of engaging sensually, um, in a way that feels safe. So there's a number of benefits to it, but basically what it is it's taking turns touching each other in a sensual way. So your job is, if you're in the role of doing the touching first, your partner lays on their stomach first. Um, and you, for the first 15 minutes, just explore different ways of touching the backside of their body. And after 15 minutes, they would flip over and you would do the same for the front. And then you
Mhm.
switch roles. What it asks you to do, though, in the first phase of sensate focus is to stay away from the erogenous zones. And what's lovely about this is if you're having difficulty with pain or discomfort or erections or what have you, then it just takes that's completely off the table because you're both going into it knowing that the focus is sharing pleasurable touch. It's not about moving on to
Mhm.
anything else. The other thing that it is it's a mindfulness exercise because this is our most important sexual organ,
That is
right?
a great thing to remind everyone of.
Yeah. Emily Nagoski talks about the concept of like the accelerator and the brake pedal. So she wrote um, Come As You Are,
Yes.
which is a really good book. And how our brains, depending on how we're thinking, we're either putting that accelerator pedal on and we're getting revved up, or we're slamming on those brakes. And so, yeah, I mean, it is really important what's going on here. So part of what the sensate focus exercise allows you to do is to practice your mindfulness by practicing really kind of dropping into your body, just noticing the sensation of being touched or touching your partner, almost as though you're touching them for the first time. And every time your mind gets pulled away, which it does, that's our brain's job, is to pump out all these thoughts,
Mhm.
feelings, memories. Every time you notice you've been swept away, oh, the kids, or we need supper, or that kind of thing. It's noticing, okay, thank you, brain. Now let me come back to the sensations in my body. And so part of it too is training um, your mindful muscle, we call it, where you're learning to anchor yourself back into the sensations in your body and what is happening in that present moment. And some of this is related to Dr. Lori Brado's work that I mentioned with
Yes.
the Better Sex Through Mindfulness. So I think the sensate focus exercise, and then what you could do is you can progress on to other stages where you then incorporate the erogenous zones. You don't pay any extra attention to them. And then the third phase is where you can, if you wanted to,
Mhm.
move on to, working toward penetration or orgasms. But it's just a really nice way of reconnecting sensually with your partner. And it usually, if people look this up online, sensate focus exercise, they'll find it very easily. And there's typically questions at the end. So it's also an opportunity to talk about what we liked and what we
Yeah.
didn't like. And
So a piece of homework, a little piece of fun
there you
homework
go.
for the audience
Yes.
to look that up.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Monique, one of the struggles is, we hear this from our girlfriends, we hear it in some of our community. You're in the throes of busyness, you're experiencing body changes, and you feel insanely guilty
Mm.
because there's this deep rooted sense that it's my duty. It, my role as a partner is to provide pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do we, let's unpack that, because I think there's a lot there.
I think it's a good point, and I agree with you. I think we're very much socialized, and some of that comes from some of that might be more pronounced for some of us than others, depending on our sort of families of origin and the messages that we learned about what our role is as women. But I think it's, I think it's really important. It seems to be becoming more accepted and more okay for us as women to want pleasure, to want sex, to like sex. I mean, it used to be sort of these patriarchal ideas that, good girls don't like sex. And I think that's shifting. And I think conversations like this are helping that to shift.
Mm.
And so I think, I think first of all, it's be careful. Are you projecting this onto your partner? Are you assuming that your partner is thinking, you're my wife, like a man needs sex? And be careful about projecting that, because
Mhm.
that may not necessarily be how your partner is thinking. But I think it's really sort of challenging some of our own beliefs that we've developed through our lifetime in terms of what our role is as women. Um, and it may give me great pleasure to provide my partner with pleasure, but is it a requirement? That's
Mhm.
very different, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And
Yeah.
then what about like my pleasure, right? And I think that's more challenging for women, is to think about what they like and what feels good for them. And showing our partners how we like to be touched, I think is uncomfortable for a lot of women. I mean, I still meet women who have never had an orgasm because their sex has been very focused on someone else's pleasure. And so it's empowering women to see that, it makes sense, right? If that your desire for sex is going to erode if it's just focused on someone
Yeah.
else's pleasure.
So there's
So
inequity in the healthcare system, and there's inequity in the bedroom. We gotta close that gap.
there can be, and
There
I think
can
I think
be.
it's okay for us to say
Yeah.
what we need.
Yeah.
I think it's vital for us to say what we need and what's important to us, and to think like, so intimacy for my partner might be sex. Intimacy for me might be dancing to our favorite song, right? And all of it is intimacy,
Mhm.
and all of it is okay, and all of it is important. Um, so it's sometimes, focusing a little bit away from sex per se, and looking at what is intimacy to us. When do we feel closest to each other?
And so rather than focus on the guilt, perhaps explore what that intimacy can look like.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
and then vocalize, which is not easy. It's not
Exactly.
easy to vocalize. Any
Exactly.
tips on vocalizing?
Um, I think being assertive is really important. I think it's hard for us as women to sometimes say what we need, and I think, you know going into a conversation like that, reminding yourself that you are a vital, essential part of this relationship. And, if my needs aren't going to be met over and over again, I'm probably not going to be a very good partner. And this probably isn't going to be a very gratifying relationship. So it's essential to talk about what our needs are, and so I think it's okay to broach that with our partners and simply say, it's always nice to start with, how you do that thing where you, maybe it's like kiss my neck or whatever. I love that, but what I would like more of is X, Y, or
Mhm.
Z. And another way to do it in regards to touch is like what we call hand over hand. So, where you put your hand over your partner's hand and you guide their hand over your body, and you show your partner where you like to be touched, how you like to be touched in that area. What amount of pressure do you like in that area? Are there areas that you really want them to stay away from? So that's kind of a nice way of also doing that, because it doesn't even involve
not
sort of
verbal.
verbalizing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a great tip. Thank you.
Yeah.
I am curious about the book that you have on the coffee table. We haven't talked about it.
Well, this is just an example of some short stories, erotic short stories for women. And it goes back to the idea that if, through menopause, a lot of women find that their drive for sex, women will say to me, like, I don't even think about it. Or like, I could care less if I ever have sex again. It's that pronounced for some people. And so, of course, we stay away from things that are sexual. So, I often say erotica is not always the best literature. But if you're an avid reader, read a chapter of your novel and then a short story and alternate that way. And the idea is, if you can't count on your brain to bring spontaneous thoughts about sex, then making a point of just being deliberate about thinking about sex a little bit more can be really helpful.
We'll put the title of this book in the description of our episode as well.
Sure.
Are there 3 takeaways you want to share when it comes to communication with your partner?
I think the big one would be acknowledge that if you have a partner, that this is a couple's issue. This is
Number 1.
Not a Monique issue or a Beatrice. This is a couple's issue that has to be managed together. I would say be careful about making assumptions.
That's a really good one. We do build narratives. Yeah. Okay, number 2.
And we feel like we know our partners so well. Like, I know exactly what he's thinking. Well, we don't always, right?
Okay, don't make assumptions. And the 3rd takeaway?
I think the 3rd takeaway point would be to really expand our idea of what intimacy is. I think we think about the concept of intimacy and we think about sex. But I think feeling close and connected to our partners it can be achieved in many different ways. So we've talked about things like sensate focus or dancing, or for some couples, it's going on a beautiful hike together. And so especially when things start to change through menopause and aging, making sure that you have other ways of feeling really connected to your partner, other forms of intimacy is really important.
It is. That's a great takeaway. Monique, it's always a pleasure to have you here. We hope you'll come back.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We can't all be Hollywood celebrities going to luxury spas every day. So basically, I found myself an affordable version. This is a shower steamer. I got it on Amazon, and basically, they are eucalyptus tablets that you put on the floor of your shower, and as the water's coming down and the heat, it just basically releases a beautiful eucalyptus smell for that luxury spa feel on a complete budget right in your home. Well, I'm not Gwyneth Paltrow, peeps.